Let me give you a brief introduction. Abigail obviously is a historian. She works on the social and urban history of late Ottoman and mandatory Palestine and the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly. Professor Jacobson's main research interest is the history of ethnically and nationally mixed spaces and communities, especially during times of war and conflict. She just finished, in fact yesterday finished copy editing the book that she's going to be talking about today, which was written together with Dr. Moshe Naor and is entitled, as you can see, Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory Palestine. Professor Jacobson taught for several years in the Department of History at MIT. She is leaving there now to become director of the Neighbors in the Mediterranean department at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute in Israel. She's also the chief editor of the Journal of Levantine Studies. So I'm going to hand it over to you. After Professor Jacobson has spoken, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Abigail.
Thank you very much, Rashid.
And I'm very, very excited to be here because it's the first opportunity that I have to actually talk about the book as a whole and not as a work in progress. So I actually finished the copy editing yesterday. I'm very excited about this, and it's supposed to be published in the fall, so it's not available yet. On May 16, 1932, an article entitled "The Arab-Jewish Conference: Understanding Between Jews and Arabs in Palestine" was published in the Beiruti newspaper Al-Alam al-Israeli. The article reported on an attempt of local or native Jews, al-Israeliyin al-Watanin, who live in Palestine and elsewhere in the Middle East, to organize a Jewish-Arab conference which would discuss the Zionist question and the relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. In such a conference, it was reported, the local Jews would serve as mediators between the Arabs and the Ashkenazi Western Jews. The article further explained that the Ashkenazi Jews do not fully understand the Arabs, their traditions and customs, whereas local Jews, meaning in this case Sephardic and Oriental Jews, can more easily reach an understanding with Palestinian Arabs because of their cultural, linguistic, and geographical proximity. The purpose of the conference was viewed as twofold: reaching a compromise between Arabs and the Zionist Arabs, as it was mentioned in the article, Sahayuni al-Arabiya, as well as demanding the Zionist movement to grant rights to the Jews of the Orient, Hukuk al-Israeli al-Sharq, as it was written in Arabic. The news about this conference became the topic of a lively debate that took place between May and August 1932 over the pages of this newspaper Al-Alam al-Israeli, as well as over the pages of Haaretz, the Hebrew newspaper which was published in Palestine. The timing of the debate is of course not coincidental. It is in the years after the 1929 events in Palestine that the Zionist movement realized the urgency of the evolving national conflict and its possible consequences. It was also around this time that several initiatives and attempts were made to reach an agreement between Jews and Arabs in the country. The conference, which is discussed in this article, should be viewed in light of this larger context. Now, the newspaper Al-Alam al-Israeli, which brought this conference to the public attention, was owned and edited by two Jews, Salim Man and Moiz Ajami, and was the only newspaper of the Jewish communities in Syria and Lebanon. It was first published in 1921 and was closed in 1948. Its main audience was the Jewish communities outside of Palestine, and it tried to enhance their connections to the Zionist movement and to the Jewish community in Palestine. In part, it also targeted the Arab readership in an effort to expose them to the Zionist movement. It was also partially supported financially by the Jewish Agency, the main executive body of the Zionist movement in Palestine, and also published articles in its behalf. However, Al-Alam al-Israeli should be examined from another lens as well. Many of its writers belong to the Sephardi and Maghrebi community in Palestine, and also wrote in some Arabic newspapers in Palestine and elsewhere in the Middle East. Those included, for example, Nissi Malul, Esther Azhari Moyal, Avraham El-Malech, Yitzhak and Tuvia Shamosh, Eliyahu Elias Sasson, and Eliyahu Agassi. The Arab-Jewish conference which served as the basis for this debate ended up not taking place. However, in many ways, the debate about it brought up a larger set of interconnected issues and reflected the dilemmas facing these Jewish intellectuals. Those include, first and foremost, the role of Oriental Jews from Palestine and the Levant as possible mediators between Jews and Arabs, the debates and tensions regarding their national and cultural identity, Zionism and the evolving national conflict, the question of loyalty and adherence of the Sephardi and Oriental local Jews to the Zionist movement, the relations between local Jews and the Zionist leadership, and the question of representation of Oriental Jews within the Zionist institutions. The participation of Palestinian Oriental Jews and other public figures from the Arab world in the debates also demonstrate the existence of a Jewish intellectual and cultural community that was active in the Levant, whose members maintained cultural, linguistic, literary, educational, political, and journalistic links among themselves. These links position this community in a unique place vis-à-vis both the Arab community in Palestine as well as within the Jewish community in the country. It is these complex links and unique position that are the central focus of the book that I would like to discuss today. The book, which is entitled Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory Palestine, is co-authored, as I said, by me and Dr. Moshe Naor from the University of Haifa, and will be published by Brandeis University Press in the fall, hopefully. The book focuses on the relations and links between Sephardi and Oriental Jews and Palestinian Arabs in Mandatory Palestine. Our main argument is that examining the relations between Jews and Arabs through the perspective of Sephardi and Oriental Jews sheds new light not only on the complexities and nuances of the Arab-Jewish conflict as a whole, but also on the Zionist perspective towards this conflict. As this book demonstrates, the Sephardi and Oriental Jewish communities are central in providing a more comprehensive and complex picture of the history of relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine and the way the Zionist movement treated what was called back then the Arab question. The narrative and perspective offered by Sephardi and Oriental Jews during this period was in many ways different from the dominant perspective of the hegemonic Zionist movement and its national institutions, which was crystallized during the 1930s under the leadership of Mapai and Labor Zionism. By focusing on this perspective, this book reveals, on the one hand, patterns of close connections, coexistence, and cooperation between Jews and Arabs, and at the very same time also sheds light on the many points of tension and friction between the two people. In fact, in many ways, we argue that in many instances it was exactly these connections, these close connections, which were based on geographical, linguistic, and cultural proximity and similarities, which contribute to the enhancement of the tensions. This unique perspective also brings to the fore the different links and connections that existed between Sephardi and Oriental Jews in Palestine and the surrounding Middle East, both within their own communities of origin, as well as within the Arab culture, history, and Arabic language. This book then offers a perspective which enables us to set Palestine and its inhabitants within its Semitic Levantine cultural context and to reconnect Palestine to the Middle Eastern environment. By this, we also challenge the dichotomy between local and foreign, or East-West, vis-a-vis the Zionist movement, and show that, in fact, the Zionist movement had more connections to the Middle East than first thought. We also break the prominent scholarly separation that exists, I have to admit, mainly within the Israeli academia, between the study of the Zionist movement and the Jewish community in Palestine on the one hand, and the study of the Middle East and its history on the other hand. And this is part of the idea of co-authoring this book, and I would love to take questions about it later. Now, just a few words of explaining who are these Oriental Jews and Sephardim and who are local Jews. So basically, this community of Oriental or Sephardim Oriental Jews is a very, very big community, very heterogeneous, right? And we have no intention of trying to generalize and say that all the things that we're saying here in this book are right and correct to all these people, right? But in general, we're looking at descendants of Jews exiled from Spain who spread to various countries, especially Italy, Turkey, and the Balkans. Also, of course, Jews from Middle Eastern countries themselves, and Palestinian Jews, okay? Palestinian indigenous Jews living in Palestine. And all these people together we call Sephardi Oriental Jews and local Jews, or Yehudei HaMizrach, okay, in Hebrew. As we demonstrate, Oriental Jews move between different locales in the Middle East while crossing geographical borders as well as boundaries of their own identity. Palestinian, Sephardi, and Oriental Jews maintained cultural, educational, economic, religious, political, and social links with their peers in the Arab world, studied in universities in Cairo and Beirut, taught in Hebrew schools in Baghdad, Damascus, Alexandria, and other cities, and wrote in various newspapers edited by Jews and Arabs in Palestine and other countries in the Middle East, as I mentioned with the debate about the conference that didn't take place. In fact, Sephardi and Oriental Jews in Palestine were part of a Levantine space and expressed the existence of an intellectual community that encouraged a debate on the nature of relations between and future, past and future relations between Arabs and Jews. The special position within the Palestinian and Levantine surroundings demonstrate the unique Jewish-Arab identity of the Sephardi and Oriental Jews. As we argue, they formed a group that could bridge between the Arab and Jewish identities as well as between geographical boundaries. In other words, Sephardi and Oriental Jews served as potential mediators not only between the old and new Yeshuv or Jewish community in Palestine and between the Jewish and Arab communities, but also, and maybe most importantly, between Jewish and Arab identities as such. This should be viewed in contrast to the Zionist project that often polarized the two. We examined the Sephardi and Oriental Jews' special position as mediators in different spheres, including the political, security, cultural, journalistic, linguistic, and social ones. We use the very charged concept of mediation in order to analyze the position of Sephardi and Oriental Jews within the complex matrix of relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The term mediation consists of various meanings and is dependent upon context and historical realities, of course. Among other meanings, cultural mediation refers to the creation of bridges and contacts among cultures, whereas political mediators are viewed as those go-betweens who act within the context of political conflicts of different types, such as, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The term mediators is used here in its political, cultural, and social contexts. These forms of mediation complemented each other and often could not be separated, and this is a point that is important to emphasize. Moreover, the cultural forms of mediation had political implications, as did the social mediation, including the economic and security spheres. The perception and self-perception of Oriental and Sephardi Jews as possible mediators was based, among other factors, on their historical links and roots in the Middle East, even before the rise of Islam. Their cultural and linguistic links and connections to Arab culture and their fluency in Arabic also added to the way they were viewed as mediators between the Zionist movement and the Arabs in Palestine. Whereas in the various Arab countries, Oriental Jews filled up this position of mediation until probably between the Jewish community and the regime or the political mainstream political party until probably the 1940s. In mandatory Palestine, the Oriental and Sephardi leadership lost its political status, which it held during the Ottoman Empire, and was no longer considered by the Zionist leadership as possible mediators between Jews and Arabs. The insistence of the Sephardim and Oriental Jews to be viewed as mediators during the British mandatory period can hence be understood as both an attempt to return to this historic role of them, rule, as well as part, not role, rule, as well as part of their efforts to go back to a more dominant and social political position within the Yeshuv, a position that they lost and that they held during Ottoman times as the representatives of the Jewish millet. Their position as mediators then should be analyzed as part of an internal power struggle within the Yeshuv, and not only through the prism of the ongoing conflict and tensions between Jews and Arabs. Many among the local Jews were enthusiastic, though also very critical, Zionists, supporters of the Zionist movement and the Zionist work in Palestine. At the same time, they also viewed themselves as cultural, linguistic, and political mediators between Jews and Arabs, and as serving as a potential bridge between the two national and ethnic communities in the country. These notions that seemed contradictory at first existed simultaneously within them. This was for many of them their special and unique form of Zionism, their interpretation of Zionism, and the way of connecting between the ethnic and the national questions, both in general and also very intimately within themselves. Moreover, the cultural, social, and political spheres in which Oriental Jews acted as mediators of different kinds enabled them also to maintain their own Jewish-Arab identity and integrate it within the national and political projects of Zionism. This is apparent in all spheres that we discuss in the book. In the cultural sphere, as the debate on the 1932 conference reveals, the fact that Sephardi and Oriental Jews were fluent in Arabic, were engaged in literary translations from Hebrew to Arabic, and vice versa, taught and studied in institutions throughout the Arab world, and were also engaged in teaching Arabic in Palestine, all contributed to their self-perception as possible go-betweens among Jews and Arabs. The journalistic arena serves as a good example for demonstrating how this group of Oriental Jews sought to create a cultural and political exchange, and how those two spheres were viewed by them as being closely connected to each other. Nissim Alul and Shimon Moyal, for example, contributed articles not only to the Hebrew press in Palestine, but also to Al-Manar and Al-Muqattam newspapers, and their translated articles were published in the local Palestinian newspapers, Palestine and Al-Carmel, among others. Other venues for publication included newspapers in Arabic that were owned by Jews, which tried to connect the local Jewish community in Palestine to the Palestinian locale. In Iraq, for example, it was the Jewish newspaper Al-Misbah, which was edited by Anwar Shaul, and in Beirut it was this newspaper Al-Alam Al-Israeli, which I mentioned earlier, and there were many others. Another such venue for cultural mediation was through the work of Oriental Jews as Arabic teachers in the Jewish community and as translators of literary texts. Such local Jews, fluent in Arabic, felt that the language can enhance contacts between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine and link the Palestinian locale to its surrounding Middle Eastern environment. Figures like Israel Ben Ze'ev, this guy over here, Avraham El-Malik, Yosef Yoel Rivlin, David Yelin, Tuvia Shamosh, and Eliyahu Sasson were active not only in Arabic teaching, but were also engaged in translating literary text from Arabic to Hebrew and vice versa, in teaching Hebrew in Jewish schools in Arab countries, and in maintaining contacts among Jewish and Arab teachers and intellectuals. These affinities and contacts highlighted the presence of a cultural community of educated Jews and Arabs who cooperated and exchanged ideas through the medium of the Arabic and Hebrew newspapers, or Arabic and Hebrew press in Palestine and elsewhere in the Middle East. The cultural links were also manifested in the lively debate in the Yeshuv concerning the need for the official institutions to publish newspapers in Arabic, and concerning the importance of teaching Arabic to different audiences in the Yeshuv. Such discussions emphasize the mediating role of Oriental and Sephardi Jews sought to play in contacts between Hebrew and Arab cultures and between Jews and Arabs. However, they also expose the ongoing tension between the commitment to cultural and social rapprochement and the exploitation of these frameworks for security and political needs. In a mobilized society such as the Yeshuv, there was inevitably a close link between cultural and educational activities and the advancement of political and security objectives. And indeed, the self-perception of these Jews as mediators was apparent in a very different way in the security sphere as well. With the enhancement of the national conflict in the 1930s and 1940s witnessed the emergence of a new generation of Sephardi and Oriental Jews who became involved in the security apparatus of the Yeshuv in different positions. This generation also highlighted the power struggle between the Oriental and Sephardi components within the Middle Eastern Jewish communities and between their two main centers of political activity. Jerusalem, which is where the kind of the old milieu, the old guard, let's say, of the Sephardi leadership was based, and the place, and Tel Aviv, which is where the younger generation was. It was also at this period that efforts were made to enhance Zionist awareness, especially among the young generation of Sephardi and Oriental youth, again, due to the doubts of the Zionist institution about the real kind of commitment of these people to the Zionist idea as such. Disguised as Arabs and speaking Arabic fluently, these Oriental Jews crossed between geographical borders as well as between borders of identity. The Arab department of the Palmach, for example, recruited young Yemenite Oriental Jews, mainly from the poor border neighborhoods in the mixed cities, to serve in their Mista'arvim units and act in disguise against Arab targets. Mista'arvim. Mista'arvim is the Jews that were disguised as Arabs, sent to Arab countries or to Arab communities in Palestine to basically collect intelligence, look after, figure out what's going on, etc. And this was especially in the 30s, following the Arab revolt, as well as we get closer to 1948 and around 1948. So Mista'arvim comes from the word Arab, of course, right? Mista'arvim. Musta'aribun, exactly.
It's the same word.
Yeah. Yeah. So to serve as in their Mista'arvim unit and act in disguise against Arab targets and collect information, intelligence, basically, either in Palestine or in the neighboring countries. Similarly, the Irgun, the paramilitary organization, Zionist paramilitary organization, recruited Oriental Jews to carry out sabotage operations against Arabs. In some cases, those Mista'arvim became so well integrated among their target populations in the Arab countries that they could provide unique testimonies on the Palestinian experience of becoming refugees during the Nakba. So, for example, this guy sitting here, in the back of the car, his name is Chavakuk Cohen, Chavakuk Cohen was a Yemenite Mista'arev, who was sent on a mission in the mixed neighborhoods of Haifa, disguised as an Arab. On April 22nd, 1948, after the Haganah launched an offensive in the city, Chavakuk described the exchange of gunfire in the Wadi Nisnas neighborhood and the reaction of the Arab residents with whom he was sitting in one of the city's cafes at the time. He then went on to describe the scenes at the eastern gate of Haifa port. There we saw a sad and appalling sight. Hundreds of men, women, and children stood on the jetty waiting to board boats that were transferring them to Acre. Women, children, and the elderly were given first place. The next day, Chavakuk Cohen continued to walk around the mainly Arab downtown section of Haifa, which was by then abandoned and deserted. He was stopped by Haganah members and transferred to the Haganah base together with other Arabs. Cohen then boarded a bus to Beirut, pretending to be a Palestinian Arab. He spent several months in Beirut, mingling with young people in the city.
His acquaintances in Beirut included Palestinian refugees he had met in Haifa. He was known in the city as the Dark Palestinian. After the war, Chavakuk served in the Israeli military intelligence. And there are many, many, many other such stories, of course. Chavakuk's reports and other similar testimonies go beyond intelligence operations in their narrow sense, we argue. They allude to the fact that these Mista'arvim were intimately involved both as actual participants and as documenters, in a way, in the changing public mood and atmosphere during the course of the 1948 war. The activities and reports of Chavakuk and his comrades thus embody an element of mediation between identities and cultures, as well as such elements as documentation and commemoration. Their personal backgrounds of either those who immigrated from Arab countries to Palestine or those who were born and raised in the border neighborhoods in the mixed cities demonstrate their complex Jewish-Arab Jewish-Arab identity. These neighborhoods, often called the Oriental ghettos, served as important meeting places for Jews and Arabs who belonged to a lower socioeconomic class and were very different from the Sephardi elite. So again, we have this issue here of the neighborhoods as a meeting place, okay? A meeting place between Jews and Arabs, all coming from the same socioeconomic background.
Give an example of a neighborhood.
So a neighborhood like this, Manshir, exactly. Manshir, or Kerem HaTeimanim, the Yemenite quarter in Tel Aviv, or Ard el-Yehud in Haifa, and other neighborhoods, of course, in the different mixed cities. So we discuss a lot this issue of, these kind of locales, okay, these mixed places. Thus, a group that considered itself to be responsible for creating bridges to the Arab community now cross these exact bridges for the purpose of sabotage and intelligence gathering. In doing so, however, and despite the clear national dimension of their activities, the Mista'arvim also cross the very personal boundaries of identity between the Arab and Jewish dimensions of their very own identities. Thus, their security activities were not devoid of a cultural dimension, as illustrated by the affinity between teaching of the Arabic language on the one hand and serving in the intelligence unit in the Yeshuv on the other hand. The perception that viewed Sephardi and Oriental Jews as possible mediators between Jews and Arabs and as offering a different perspective than the hegemonic Zionist Ashkenazi leadership was discussed and debated also within the Palestinian, some parts of the Palestinian Arab leadership at the time. Some continue to discuss the special status of Arab Jews as an inherent part of Palestine, and this is how they were often called Arab Jews, as well as the effects that the Zionist immigration had on Jewish-Arab relations in the country. In February 26, 1922, for example, the newspaper As-Sabah published Jamal al-Husseini's call for local Jews on behalf of the Arab Executive Committee. His call was quoted in Haaretz newspaper in Hebrew. Under the title "Come to Us," al-Husseini wrote, "To our Jewish fellow natives of the homeland, to those who were cheated by Zionism, to those who understand the goals and damage of the Zionist movement, to them we extend our hands today and call, come to us. We are your friends. You share the same rights and duties in Palestine as we do, because you and us are the sons of the same homeland, whether the Zionists like it or not. We're sorry for your persecution by the Zionists, and hence your Muslim and Christian brothers extend their arms and call you, come to us." This is 1922. In 1923, Jamal al-Husseini again issued an appeal on behalf of the Arab Executive Committee to the native Jews, al-Yahud al-Watanin. He repeated his appeal from the previous year, this one, and urged the Jews of Palestine who lived with us before the war in peace and friendship not to be misled by the false dream of Zionism, but to stand together with the Arabs in their demand to nullify the Balfour Declaration. It is our duty as neighbors to warn the Jews who lived with us before the war and loved our neighborliness to get away from Zionism, wrote al-Husseini at the time.
Which war is he talking about?
The First World War, 1922. I mean, he said that in 1922, he's talking about the First World War at that time. Such statements, as well as the criticism and suspicion towards Oriental Jews from certain circles within the Zionist movement, placed those local Jews in a tough position then. They were demanded to choose between a local territorial identity as being part of a joint homeland for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and the Jewish ethno-national identity. The doubts regarding their loyalty and adherence to Zionism, to the Zionist movement, highlighted the local Jews' position of otherness vis-a-vis the European hegemonic Zionist circles, and created almost a constant need to apologize and protect their own national belief as both loyal Zionists and possible mediators between Jews and Arabs. This apologetic notion was apparent also regarding other accusations from prominent figures in the Yeshuv, as well as from some European leaders who questioned the degree of loyalty of the Sephardim and the Oriental Jews to the Zionist movement. This issue of the complex position of Sephardi and Oriental Jews within the Zionist establishment and institutions is discussed a lot in our book as well. In his comments to the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947, Eliyahu El-Yashar, one of the central figures among the Sephardi community in Palestine, said the following: "Having been born in Oriental countries, knowing their customs and languages, their mode of life and their ethics, the Sephardim are called upon to play a greater role in the establishment of harmony and peace through the Middle Eastern countries." This is 1947 in the UN Special Committee that tried to investigate or to look into the Palestinian affairs, and later on suggested the partition plan. However, this claim that Oriental Jews bore a historic role to serve as a bridge between Jews and Arabs lost its validity after 1948. Indeed, to a large extent, this claim was forgotten and obscured as part of the voices, as were the voices of the other inhabitants of the Middle East that had once echoed around the local and regional Levantine locales of the Mandate period, although in a very diverse and sometimes contradictory manner. Those Oriental Jews who view themselves both as natives of the Orient as well as of natives of the country found themselves displaced as a result of 1948, not only from the Orient as such, but also from their own historical position. At the same time, the Sephardi and Oriental Jews who sought to cross geographical borders, boundaries, and the boundaries of their own identity also contributed in different ways to the very creation of these boundaries post-1948. In this book, we thus aim to bring these Oriental and indigenous voices back to center stage, explore and identify the seeming contradictions and ambivalences in their perceptions and identities, and I'm highlighting here the ambivalences, okay, and the contradictions, and highlight the often ignored existence of this Levantine and Mediterranean locale, which was historically shared by so many as Oriental neighbors. Thank you. So really there was no one political plan, okay? They didn't have one unified political plan. And they didn't have, they also, interestingly enough, they also belonged to different political factions and parties, right, within the Jewish community and within the Zionist movement. So some were part actually of the revisionist party, some were part of labor Zionism of Mapai, some were part of Brit Shalom and other organizations and movements within the Jewish community. And they had actually a very complex relationship with those associations such as Brit Shalom, Kedma Mizracha, all these kind of peaceniks associations at the time. But they didn't have...
Anachronistic term.
Right, yeah. And they didn't have, well, you know, and they didn't have one program. But what really unified them, okay, in all their writings, to wherever party they belonged, was this idea of we, as Jews of the Orient, can serve as this, we have a special role. We have a special position, which is nothing that the Ben-Gurionistic, basically, leadership can share and can understand. So that was like the main thing that they shared, the main idea that they shared among themselves, regardless of their political agendas or imaginations, but let's say, of the future.
Howard.
I'm interested in the numbers.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Howard Schoen,
Friend of the History Department.
friend of the History Department, and of Rashid. Do you know what percentage of the Jews in, let's say, 32 and 48 were Sephardic?
Yeah, so I actually have, you turn this
I can turn
off.
it back on.
I actually have a slide here, just because I'm very bad at numbers, so I prepared a slide.
You have the sound of it.
So
It'll come on.
So basically, in 1936, okay, we have several population figures here, some demographic information. So in 1936, out of a total population of around 400,000 Jewish Jews in Palestine, around 94,000 identified themselves as Sephardi and Oriental Jews, according to the Zionist estimates. Okay, the statistics of the statistical department of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency and the Zionist movement identified basically three groups. Okay, they talked about Yemenite Jews as one category, Sephardi Jews as a second category, and then others that were defined as Edot HaMizrach, or Jews of Oriental countries. Okay, and altogether they were around 94,000. Okay, out of 404. And then at the end of 1945, we have the percentage. So this is the percentage, as you see here, 592,000 people, which consisted of around 22%. 592 people, out of which 22% were non-Ashkenazi Jews.
I'm surprised at the low percentage in 36.
Right. So so during this time, first of all, there were Jews coming in.
Huge immigration.
Exactly. Huge immigration coming in, both of Ashkenazi and of Oriental Jews. Okay? It's quite interesting, the categories here, the categories that are used as Yemenite, Sephardi, and Edot HaMizrach, or, Jews of the Orient. Okay? So this is more or less the percent. So it was never like a majority, right? We're not talking about a majority here at all, right, among the Jewish issue, right?
Lady here, the gentleman there, and then Susan. That's well, we're just going to go the way I said. So you, ma'am,
Sherry
then you,
Breslin.
Susan.
My question has to do with the mandatory power of the British. How did they see these people? Did they suppress them, ignore them? It seems that they would have been useful to the Oriental Jews.
So it really depends. Really depends. I mean, we didn't actually deal so much with the British. It was less of our concern. Our concern was mainly the relations between those people and the Zionist movement, and their position within the Zionist movement on the one hand, and the relationship that they held with the Arab community at the time, and the Arab leadership. The British didn't really understand these people. They didn't really understand their position that well. They couldn't quite figure them out. Okay, they were too confusing to them, I think, in many ways. And also, they didn't hold any position of power. That's the thing, right? I mean, so one of the things that we're showing in the book is that we're having here kind of a historic transition between the Ottoman times, in which these people actually held a very important position as the representatives of the Jewish millet, as the representative of the Jewish community vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman administration, to the British mandatory period, where they totally lost this position, right? So the British really dealt with mainly with the hegemonic Zionist leadership, and of course with all those who kind of bothered them and interrupted them in many ways, right, throughout this period.
Yeah, and just to add that the British were dealing with the people who were in London and in Europe.
Right, exactly.
With whom they had
who
dealt.
spoke with the same language, if you may, right? And they really didn't know exactly how to deal with them. So in 1948, as you said, we have several such stories, such as Chavakuk Cohen memoirs, right, that were written by those people, and on those people, and on the role that they served as Jews in disguise to Arabs, right? Who were so well, played the role so well that this Havakuk Cohen guy was discussed as the dark Palestinian, right? So there are several such examples. I can't tell you right now from the top of my head, but interestingly, many of those people before 1948 were also very, very much integrated within different political movements in the Arab world. So, for example, Eliyahu Sasson, who is a very famous and well-known figure, okay, and kind of who played an important role in the Zionist movement after the 1930s mainly. Originally is an Oriental Jew, okay, and spent a lot of time with Faisal. So he spent a lot of time with Faisal and with his group of people, right? His surrounding, the people were surrounded, together with other Jews, some of whom were exiled from Palestine as part of, as a result of World War I, but some of whom were just, traveling to Palestine. So he was not exiled. He actually traveled to Damascus, was part of this milieu, basically, and became very, very good friends with many of those who surrounded Faisal, the Faisal regime over there. Okay, so held and continued holding all these links and connections to those people in the years after, when he was engaged with different attempts of, getting to reaching some kind of an agreement between Jews and Arabs, of different kinds and of different ways, right? Eliyahu Sasson is one of the figures that we focus on in the book quite a bit. Very interesting biography he has. So there are different people, and then you have, of course, people who served, who were living in the Arab world and teaching Hebrew or Arabic and studying in different institutions. Everything is before 1948, absolutely, yeah.
How important is, say, Beirut and Cairo and these other kinds of centers, which you mentioned a little bit, centers of kind of learning and culture for this group of people? And related to that, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you did your research then.
So first of all, yes. So your first question, 1948 is a pivotal moment, of course, right? Because 1948 was the moment in which the boundaries were set.
Yeah.
Not only, within the Israeli-Palestinian context, but also in many ways within the Arab world, right? Even though some of the countries became independent before. So, in the period before 1948, which is what this book is about, during the British and French colonial rule, those cities, the cities of Beirut and Damascus and Alexandria and Baghdad, were extremely important in terms of the way they served as centers for intellectual, cultural, educational activities of these and journalistic activities of these people. So as I mentioned, and this connects me to the second part. So one of the main links was through schools in which they taught, and which we found evidence of, and newspapers in which they wrote. So many of these people that we kind of followed in this research and focused on wrote in all these newspapers throughout the Arab world. And we located, articles, some of which were then translated in Hebrew, in the Hebrew press, located articles that they wrote in the Arabic press all around the Arab world, located their memoirs, evidence of where they were, what did they do in different periods of time. And we couldn't go to Beirut, of course, to do research. So most of our research was done in Israel, in fact, and through the Israeli archives and the British, the PRO, and a lot through newspapers. A lot of the work was done in newspapers and in different, memoirs and etc.
My question was about the Al Husseini offer. I never heard about that. Were there any Sephardi Jews who accepted the offer, or who identified more as Arab rather, or who, and in so doing felt more Arab than affiliated with the Zionist movement?
So very few. Mostly those people got into a real problem and real trouble with these kind of statements coming from Arab leaders. And it goes back to what I mentioned about their apologetic, their need to apologize and their need to kind of say, to prove their loyalty, okay? Because when these statements were published from, Arab leaders, in which they basically, what did Husseini try to do? He tried to break the link, right? He tried to break the Zionist movement, tried to detach them from the Zionist movement. And they said, no, we are Zionists, right? We are Zionists, we are supporters of Zionists, and we know exactly what Zionism is, right? And we're loyal Zionists, that's the thing. We're loyal Zionists, but at the same time, we also think that we can deal with the Arab problem better, or the Arab question better than the Mapai leadership can. Okay, so after such, we have different accounts of debates, again in the press, going back and forth between different figures within the Zionist administration and different figures within the Zionist and Oriental, among Zionist and Sephardi and Oriental Jews, saying, in which the Zionists are blaming them, or are questioning their loyalty and their understanding of what Zionism really is. And then they are, the Sephardi Oriental Jews are answering and saying, of course we know what Zionism is. Of course we're loyal Zionists and we stand behind the Zionist project. However, we also have, a twist.
Did they perhaps have a somewhat different understanding of Zionism than maybe the Ashkenazi Mapai leadership?
Of course.
Do you want to just say something about that?
Yes, they did. They did have so again. They did have a different understanding of Zionism. In my first book, I was making this distinction between inclusive and exclusive.
I know you know this.
Right.
That's why I asked you that.
Right. The inclusive. No, we're having a conversation. Rashid, we're having a conversation. Inclusive and exclusive notion of Zionism, right? When for them Zionism was different than the hegemonic form of Zionism of the Zionist movement, and they were thinking about it in a less deterministic way, basically. And they were thinking that actually, the Arabs are there, they need to be taken into account, right? And the Zionist movement needs to deal somehow with the Arab question. How exactly? That's going back to what you asked, right? They didn't really have the answer of how. They didn't have the political agenda of, okay, this is the plan, right? They offered different plans and different ideas and different understandings, but it was clear to them that the Arabs should be taken very, very seriously and very much into account, and that their historic role, basically, is this rule of bridging between the two.
The follow-up is, so you extend your thesis of exclusive versus inclusive Zionism from the Ottoman period into, you think that continues as a way of thinking about Sephardic Zionism through the British period. And that's the first question, that's the follow-up. And the second is, I'm curious about the concept of mediation, which you've clearly been thinking a great deal about. And so you spoke about cultural mediation, or mediators, cultural mediators, linguistic, political, social. And most of those, I think I understand what they mean. Linguistic mediators will explain things and interpret. Political will sort of be that go-between politically. But you also spoke about mediators of identity, and I'm curious if you could explain precisely what you mean by that.
So mainly the issue of identity here comes into the picture when we're talking about the security sphere, more than anything else, because part of the argument that we're making in the book is that for those people, because they were in many ways torn as a result of the polarization of the Zionist movement and the way the Zionist movement polarized between basically Jews and Arabs, Jewish identity and Arab identity, right, in many ways. So they found through their different activities, okay, as Mista'arvim, as literary translators, okay, as teachers through the language, right, question, they found ways and venues of bridging between those two identities of their own, that they actually had
Internal mediation.
exactly internal, very intimate, I would say even, mediation between their own identities, between their two facets basically of their own identity, the Jewish and Arab part of their own identity. And some of these people, for example, just as an example, going back maybe to the question that was asked over there earlier, for example, when those Mista'arvim, those Jews in disguise, okay, went on different security missions or intelligence gathering missions or whatever, or sabotaging operations, right? To different Arab countries or villages or whatever, they adopted as their name, they adopted their old Arab name, right? Their old name from the period before they immigrated to Palestine, Exactly, their pre Eretz Israeli name, let's put it this way, right? So, or the pre-Zionist name. So I think even this, is like in a way a hint to this kind of. So they really used their language abilities, they used their identity, and they used the way they felt very comfortable. That's another thing here, very, very comfortable. So going back to what you asked earlier, Eliyahu Sasson, for example, is recorded as talking about, as kind of remembering the days in which he spent in Damascus, where he, people totally thought that he's Palestinian Arab, had no idea that he's Jewish, right? So, but again, this tension between, so it's not so naive, right? It's not. It also served a certain purpose, right? And this is exactly this tension that we're dealing with in the book.
Abhinav Shalem, I teach here at Columbia. I wonder, the story that you tell actually is a very sad story. If you come to think about these people moving from being neighbors into becoming enemies. And I wonder if we forget now the question of nation, the making of nation and making of states, one would call them collaborators. So how did they go with that? Because it's very sad. The only moment they could feel themselves as themselves is to be aspiring to get the name that you used to have when you were what you were. So any regrets about it? Any words of reflection about how Zionism brought them to this situation? Is there any critical approach to Zionism from their voices on what was happening? And the second question, maybe you could elaborate more. I know it from my family. There was another possibility to be more moral, but it demands actually to be excluded in a way that you could join the Communist Party and you lose a lot of benefits from it. And later on in 48, of course, you are outcasted. Can you talk about these people as well?
Sure.
Have you come across these ones?
Sure. So one of the examples is where I'll start from the end, from the Communist Party, because the communists are close to my heart. So one of the examples that we talked about was, for example, Simchat Sabari, right? The Yemenite activist and in the Communist Party, in the Palestinian Communist Party, that was married to Radwan Khilu, right? And we're talking about her in relation to this group of people who were part of this group, right? But chose a different way, okay? And there were many others. I didn't mention them here, but these people are, again, a very heterogeneous movement. And they didn't all speak in the same language. They didn't all say the same things. They didn't all do the same things. So not everyone were spies, right? So different people chose to do different things. So we're kind of giving some examples here. But yes, definitely among the communists, for example, there were people who took completely different directions than the ones described here, and crossed the lines, right? And crossed the lines. And there were other people who were not, again, did not serve as Mista'arvim, etc. So that's about this, and about the question of collaboration. So of course, super like the word mediation, right? This word collaboration, I think, needs to be really broken, contextualized, and complicated. Because how do you even define collaboration? And you cannot just say collaboration and without contextualizing it and without thinking about it in this moment. So the question is whether these people view themselves as collaborators, with whom? With the Zionist movement? Maybe, but the Zionist movement viewed them in part as collaborators with the Palestinians, you know? So collaboration here is very complicated. It's a very complicated theme and a very complicated idea in the context of this time. And again, apropos Hillel Cohen's book, Collaborators in the Service of Zionism.
Where he's talking about Arabs, of course.
Of course, he was talking about Arabs. Yes. He was talking about Arabs. Yeah, but this again, like the term mediators or mediation, collaboration, I think also needs to be contextualized and thought about very critically in light of the period and in light of the political atmosphere.
What about the part of the period?
After the period, in retrospect. So many of these people, in their memoirs, when you read their memoirs, they are very sad because they are saying, like some people like Eliyahu El-Yashar, for example, who published, 2 important books, Living with Palestinians and Living with Jews, okay, 2 separate books. He was, he keeps regretting about this lost opportunity and how these people have never really, their imagination, their different imagination has never really, became a reality. Not during the mandatory years, not after the mandatory years, within the state of Israel. They were always very frustrated in different ways and felt that it's a missed opportunity in some way. Or that their historic role was missed, right? And that they were unable to carry out their agenda, their thought.
Thank you very much. Join me.
Thank you.